Welcome to the Music Room for October 22nd, 2019. I'd like to welcome all my new subscribers to the channel. I'll kind of give you a brief overview of what the Music Room segments are all about. It's typically me telling a story about an event in my life that involves somebody else, that it revolves around music. So when I hear a song, I'm reminded of that person, and I record these stories. This segment's a little bit different. 50 years ago today, Led Zeppelin came out with their second album. Now, I've done the Led Zeppelin 1 about 9 months ago. Today, on October 22nd, they came out with Led Zeppelin 2. And I'm going to talk a little bit about not how this album changed my life, not how a song changed my life, but how a small section of a song, about 18 seconds worth, how it's affected my life in really interesting ways. And some people call this a turning point. But let's go back to 1974. So in 1974, I moved to Los Alamos and I got a newspaper route, and I ended up buying a radio very similar to this one. This is a Panasonic AM radio. And I would listen to this in the evenings. And, if you don't know this, AM radio travels a long way in the evenings because of the radio waves bounce off the atmosphere, the ionosphere. But I bought this radio, and I was able to get cities like Oklahoma City, Denver, and Omaha. And I became kind of fascinated with the fact that radio waves could go so far. So that ended up leading into listening to music. Now, I bought an AM radio because I only had enough money to buy an AM radio. I didn't get an FM radio until a couple years later. But that was when I was in grade school. In junior high, a friend of mine, and his name is Alistair, his older brothers listened to a lot of different types of music, primarily the rock music of the 70s. And Alistair recorded a mixtape for me on an Ampex C45. Now, how do I know what the brand of the cassette was? Because I ended up stealing it from my 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Hotchkiss, from her AV box. I took a cassette tape, and Alistair put a mix of Led Zeppelin and Jethro Tull on it. And he would alternate between a Led Zeppelin song and a Jethro Tull song and a Led Zeppelin, and go that way through. And there's about 5 to 6 songs on the side. And then you'd flip it over. So it's 45 minutes of these two bands. And what I found over listening to this on my little Panasonic tape recorder at the time was that I was fast forwarding it over the Jethro Tull songs. Now, Jethro Tull is here in the music room as well. But I found myself gravitating more towards the Led Zeppelin songs than that. So I became a Zeppelin fan, like millions and millions and hundreds of millions of other people around the world. And because of that, I got interested in stereo equipment. And an example of that was in 1978, before I even had a driver's license, I bought a car stereo, primarily for my parents' cars. It was a Panasonic, what the heck was it? Yeah, I think it was a Panasonic KP4000. No, it's Pioneer KP4000. Here's a picture of it here. And I had one of those little slide-out rack things that you normally would mount a CB radio on. You could take out of your truck or whatever, take it in your house and no one would steal it. So I had my Pioneer cassette player on one of these slide-out mounts, and then I could also play it in my house. So I had a stereo in my house. Now, that particular car stereo, it didn't even have fast forward. It had fast forward, but you had to hold the button down. Anyway, I'm getting too much in the weeds. So I had a car stereo before I even had a car, and but I was delivering newspapers along the way, and the money that I would get from the newspaper route, I would end up buying either like motorcycles or mini bikes or go-karts or whatever, or I'd buy music equipment. And then that changed when I got a driver's license, because I went from delivering the newspapers to the individual houses to actually working for the local newspaper, and I would deliver the bundles of papers to the carriers. And when you do that, you actually make some money, and it doesn't take for a lot of time during the day to do that as a part-time job. But what I found was almost all the money that I made from the newspaper route, I bought stereo equipment. And here's a picture of my stereo equipment that I had in high school. And yes, that is a picture of me in high school. I really had long hair back then. And so that setup there was a Technics setup when I had a Technics turntable, tuner, amplifier, equalizer, and I don't remember what kind of speakers I had back then. But anyway, so I had all Technique stuff, and it all looked the same. It was the same width. It was kind of nice. And so throughout that time, I kind of became more and more fascinated with amplifiers and what is this thing called distortion and signal to noise ratio and all that kind of thing. My brother told me, he said, you should become an electrical engineer and learn how to design this stuff. And I was like, oh, well, that's really very interesting to me. So I started, went to New Mexico State and got a bachelor's in electrical engineering, primarily to learn about analog. And I got to the point where, while I was still an undergraduate, I started teaching the undergraduate analog lab. It's called WE322. And here's a picture of me teaching that there. And I primarily got into teaching because it forced me to really understand a topic. And so I taught through undergraduate and through my undergrad and my master's degree. And during that time, I ended up co-oping at IBM. And the first time I co-opted was in Tucson in 1985. And that was the first time I was really making like real money. And I bought more stereo equipment. So it turns out this is going to be a long segment. So just hang on. We'll get to the song here in just a minute. So, bought more equipment. My sister was working at a stereo. She's working a Monster cable. And she was able to buy stereo equipment from other manufacturers at cost. So I bought my dream stereo. I bought a Nakamichi tape deck. I bought a Carver preamp, which I still have here. Hafler amplifier. I had 2 DBX units. I had a noise reduction system. And I had a dynamic range extender. But I never bought speakers. I didn't actually get speakers until much later in my life. I always wanted Klipsch horns, but those are ridiculously large and could never make a room that fit a pair of Klipsch horns. But I ended up buying my dream stereo, and I have all those pieces today. And so I got done with my undergraduate degree, and I hadn't learned what I needed to learn about making amplifiers. So I kept going to school. I got a master's degree there at New Mexico State. And I started teaching the senior level analog class, which was called WE421. And I taught that for about a year and a half. And I got done with my master's, and I still did not know what I went to college for, which was, I didn't get down to the nitty-gritty about how amplifiers really work. And at this point, when you get to the end of your master's degree, you know about the devices, you know about transistors, you know about all that stuff, but you don't really know the ins and outs of how the fabrication part works. It's like, how do you make a transistor? So I went to get my PhD. And at the time, I didn't have any money. I had to go to a place that was going to pay for me to go to school. And the most attractive offer was from Georgia Tech. And so I ended up moving from New Mexico out to Georgia, to Atlanta. And I got synced up with Dr. Allen. And Dr. Allen, for anyone who learned any CMOS stuff in the 80s and early 90s, everyone learned CMOS from the Red Book. They call it the Red Book. The Red Book was Dr. Allen's book, and he was my advisor. And so I went through that PhD program, and I learned all about, device fabrication as well as circuit simulation. I really wrote one of the first circuit simulators based on SPICE in C++. And this was actually written in C++ before there was a C++. But I got done with that. And then about halfway through that degree, I learned what I went to college for. I had learned everything I needed to learn, and I got my degree, and then I had a decision to make. Should I go into doing analog circuit design? Maybe work on amplifiers, go into that field? But then I decided to not do that. I wanted to keep my passion in life, audio and stereos and music and that kind of thing, a personal thing, and then have a professional career that's not the same. So I got kind of migrated in towards the embedded route, and I ended up working a company that made stuff for petroleum industry, and I designed the first digital chemical additive injector system for gasoline, and I got a patent on that. And then after that, I basically started a series of startups. And I think over the time, in the last 20, 25 years, I've been involved in about 14 startups. And, but what I ended up doing, I'll just kind of run through some of the things that I did in my career. I worked on wireless radio technology for hazardous area environments. I worked in the healthcare industry. I worked on digital signal processors. I did network design. I worked on the Metro North Railroad network design. I worked in cable television industry. I designed some equipment that goes on poles, and I learned a lot about, at that time I was using Linux. This is right around about 1998. I had started using Slackware on Linux about 1994. And I downloaded it on a bunch of 5.25-inch floppies when I was at the wireless company. And I put in my first, IoT, Internet of Things is kind of the big term now. I put in my first Internet of Thing in a truck stop in Ocala, Florida, the Flying J, in 1995, and it was taking telemetry information and logging that, and then once a day do a dial-up and upload that to a database. But I learned a lot about Linux throughout that time, and then when the downturn, the dot-com burst, I didn't have a job, so I wrote a book, embedded Linux book, and I taught seminars for that for about 5 years, and just kind of helped companies get involved in using Linux for their product development. Now Linux is everywhere. Billions of devices, Android phones, HVAC equipment, Raspberry Pis. It's already down to $5 devices, and it's really exploded. But back in those days, my book was the first real book on embedded Linux. And because I was working at startups, what I ended up finding out was that companies ended up hiring me specifically because I didn't know anything about what they were doing. And I found this kind of odd, but it's like a trend in my career, was that companies would hire me because I knew nothing about what they were doing. And I would come in and look at what their real problems were. And basically what I was doing was taking the skill set that I learned as I got my PhD, about the process of finding a problem, identifying it, researching a problem, and finding a solution. Those skills are what I really took away from my PhD, and that's what's kind of helped me in my professional career, was that I'm able to listen to people's problems and help them find a solution to those problems. And so since then, I've worked in national defense. I ended up finding a nice pair of speakers here for my house. I bought some giant Polk audio speakers. I worked in a shipping company that did daily shipping. I've worked on amusement park rides. I've worked out at the test site in Nevada. I've worked at a solar startup. I got a patent over there at the solar startup. I worked on 4K video distribution for high-end audio video equipment. I worked in the fitness industry. And right now I'm working at a cryogenics company here, actually in the town I live in. And people along the way ask me, what do you do? And it's always really hard for me to explain that, because what I've done in my career is so many different projects, so many different companies, so many different industries. I couldn't really explain it. Am I a hardware designer? Am I a software designer? Am I a firmware designer? Am I a software architect? It's really hard for me to come up with that. But then I started really thinking about what I was doing, and there's a term in the startup industry now called the minimal viable product. And that's where the startups will get to the point where they have a minimal viable product, which is the simplest implementation of what they're trying to achieve. And so what I am really, after all this time, is I am a minimal viable product prototype engineer. So I help companies develop their MVP, and from that they can visualize and actually physicalize their ideas into something real and go and seek additional funding or whatever. They're start marketing it or whatever they want to do. So I'm an MVP engineer. And because I started doing that, I needed to learn a lot more skills. And along the way, because I'm working in a lot of different industries, I had to continually learn a lot of everything all the time. It's a continuous process of learning new things that I had no idea about at all. And lately, I've learned a lot about CAD. I've learned a lot about additive manufacturing, not just simply 3D printing, but just additive manufacturing in general, as well as traditional machining and CNC work and machine control. And because of that, it keeps me busy, and I can actually relate some of my audio projects to what I'm working on at work. And we'll get to an example of that in just a minute. But at some point, we bought a house here in town, and up in the attic was an old Philco tube radio. And it's beautiful. It's called the Cathedral Radio. And it came with the house. And so I got it out, and I was immediately thinking, wow, it'd really be cool to just kind of take all these stupid tubes out of here. I never learned about tubes because I went to school in the 80s. So by then I was learning about BJTs, bipolar junction transistors, and CMOS. So I never really learned about tubes. So I just kind of gut the whole thing and put a Bluetooth receiver in there and have my phone be able to stream to this beautiful old radio. And I started looking at it. It was really well built. 1929. Excellent condition, well preserved in that attic. And I decided, no, maybe I should learn how to fix this thing, see if I can get it to work. So I started this odyssey, this latest adventure into audio, having to deal with learning about vacuum tubes. And so because of that, I spent the last 4 or 5 years learning about vacuum tube amplifier design and circuits having to do with vacuum tubes. And it's not an easy thing to learn about because, I'll give you an example. So I ended up buying a bunch of books. There's a bunch of classic books that everyone recommends you buy. And those books are typically like this one here. This one's called Theory and Applications of Electron Tubes by Reich. And this book here is written in 1941-ish, yeah. And this book is excellent. It's got a lot of things in here. I learned a lot about things in this book, but what I found out was that books like this that are so old, when I first started reading this, they'll want to go over some kind of topic, and then they'll spend 10 pages on the math calculations, hand calculations, to get to an answer, using various types of integrations or substitutions or Taylor series expansions or whatever to get to that point. And I was reading all this stuff. I was like, this is ridiculously complicated. And I look back at this thing. I'm like, oh, this book's written in 1941. This book was written before the bomb. This book was written. These guys didn't even have calculators. They're doing everything by hand. So that's what they had back then. Now it's, these equations, you could just put them in a nonlinear solver and have the whole thing solve it for you. But it was fairly difficult to understand how, from engineering design perspective, how to do real design work for vacuum tubes, because the classic textbooks of the time are written before there were calculators. There were certainly not computers, but there were certainly before there were calculators. They were using slide rules. So you have to understand the concept, the math at the time, and be able to relate that to how you would solve it today. And that's what makes it fairly complicated to design these things. But also, all these books are written from an engineering perspective. So if you're designing audio amplifiers, like what we're doing here in the music room, for audio production, you want a low distortion kind of, you want a low distortion design. That's just inherent in audio production. So all the books are written for that in mind. But I am more interested in now guitar amplifier design. So it turns out the guitar amplifier design, everything all the education that I've had about circuit design, kind of circuit theory, making things linear, linearization techniques, feedback techniques, all those types of things, throw all that away. Because with a guitar amplifier, you actually want to design it with distortion. And you want not only with distortion, but with a particular kind of distortion. And that makes the problem really, really interesting. Well, it's interesting to me, but it really makes it kind of complicated. And so, like I said, I've spent quite an amount of time, 4 to 5 years of trying to figure out how these guitar amplifiers work, because they're really really simple designs, but down at the core of the picking of all the component values and that kind of thing, it's really quite complicated in order to get the kind of sound you would like to get. Okay, this is a really long story, but we'll have one more little add to this, and then we'll listen to this piece here. So one of these pieces of equipment that I just recently designed for this cryogenic company here in Colorado, I went and put it in a field test down in San Antonio in a semiconductor fabrication facility, and we put it on this thing called an implanter. Now, an implanter in the semiconductor fab process is the very first process where they bring the blank silicon wafers in and they implant ions into the surface to go from silicon to becoming a semiconductor. And so I got to be down there, and I'm talking to the technician, and he's showing me his control panel. And over here on the right hand side, on the left hand side, he's got this. There's a picture of this thing, and they call it. It's called a cathode, and there's a cathode current. And then he's explaining to me, well, the cathode heats up, and then these ions fly off the cathode, and they're accelerated through this electric field over to this thing called the anode. And then in the middle there, we have these screens that control the flow of the ions through the vacuum. And I just started laughing. He goes, "What are you laughing at?" I'm like, "This is exactly how a vacuum tube works." And he goes, "Yeah, well, that's what this is." So in their terms, they're implanting silicon wafers, but in actuality, they're accelerating particles through an electric field and controlling it through both magnet for directivity and as well as the velocity of the particle of the implanting process. So it is much like a vacuum tube. So let me see here. We are at 25 minutes. Let's see if we can wrap this up. All right. What has come about because of a piece of song off of here, and I'm going to go ahead and put it on. This was, like I said, this was on that Ampex cassette tape. And this is the first song on side one. Everyone in the world has heard this song. This is Whole Lotta Love. I'm just going to play this first little part. Actually, it's the part towards the middle of it. Uh-oh, what's going on here? My turntable's not plugged in. What's the deal here? There we go. Okay. So we'll go ahead and put this on, and I'll tell you about the okay, it's coming up here. All right, it's starting right here. Okay, so it's this part right here. And so when I look back at my life, that little 18 seconds or so, I've kind of isolated that as the portion that really inspired me to learn about amplifiers. And because of that, I bought a lot of stereo equipment, and I went to school for a long time. And I got a PhD, and I decided to not do amplifier design. But because of that, I ended up having to work. I ended up working in a lot of different industries, and it taught me that I could figure out a lot of. It gave me the confidence that I could figure out problems in all these different problem sets that I was presented with. And what's really happened because of this little section of song was I have a kind of intense curiosity towards learning new things. And so, I try to learn something new almost all the time. And when I look back at when I specifically talk to young people, I really think about, well, what can I do that might spark their Ampex tape with a whole lot of love in it? You know, the equivalent of that in their life. What can I do to help them find that thing that's going to really be the turning point in their life? All right, thanks for watching. This is the Music Room for October 22nd, 2019.